Now, I've made some changes since the upgrade wheel video, primarily around bug fixing with that system, as well as I've added some camera shake to each individual shot. So there's not a lot here, but when I fire the pistol, but when I get hit, it's pretty substantial to alert the player that something has gone wrong. And then we picked up an upgrade here, so we'll go ahead and grab that. But there are still some things that are off with the game and the feeling of it that I want to fix today. So if you notice, as I'm running by these enemies, they often stop to attack me before I would even be in danger because they are attacking me as soon as I enter their hurt box. And they use that to determine where they can actually hit me. So I think, unfortunately, I need a new zone for them to determine when to start their attack versus when the attack can actually hurt me. That's a little closer to them, just so they get in a little bit closer to me before they stop moving, to make the game a little bit more challenging. Because right now, if I just run in a circle, I've got all these enemies here, and I don't really have to do all that much to evade them. The second thing is when I shoot an enemy, I have a knockback force being applied to them, or at least most of them. And this is a flat velocity impulse. So if you can see this, when I shoot an enemy, he just flies straight back, basically, away from me. And what I want to do is enter this as kind of a logarithmic curve so that it starts really strong and ends a little bit more subtly. So that way, when I'm hitting these enemies backwards, it looks a bit more realistic and feels a bit punchier. Some other things that we can do are add some animations and effects to the gun when it's firing, because right now we have bullets that are coming out, but there's no actual impulse on the gun, no shells being ejected, no lights lighting up to show that the gun is actually firing. There are some things that we can do, and the upgrades, could be a bit better as well. Right now it's just this plus icon. I would like to, make it kind of bob up and down and have some kind of hologram effect to denote that this is, a separate entity other than just the shape and color of it. And also there's no shadow or anything. It doesn't stick out. So there's a few things that we need to address just for the feel of the game that are more like polish related for this core loop. And I also want to address the rolling system. So when I roll here, it's a pretty straight, just slight buff to my current velocity for the player. So I definitely want to make that a lot sharper so that way we can have it work similarly to that knockback system and just be a bit punchier and more direct. So we'll probably come up with a roll range that it will always set you at, and then a variable velocity inside of that range. So that way you can be consistent with how you're doing the roll, but the speed of your roll can change throughout the roll. So I think I want to start with adding some realism to the firing. That is the kind of focal point of the screen for the combat, and having it have no reaction to the player input definitely is a bit jarring, and I want this to be really polished. Okay, so here we are in A Sprite, and I've got these gun sprites from Pen USB Mike, who is a online artist who I bought several of the sprites for this game for. And we have a few different weapons here to select from. They all have roughly the same color palette and the same styling. So I think that making one shell case for each of them is a little redundant. We'll probably just do one similar type of shell casing, except for those rare cases, like if we add in like some kind of rocket launcher or something like that. So for me, we'll probably stick with this sprite. And so I've created a bigger canvas here. This is 64 by 64 pixels. And I've superimposed the laser pistol on it. So that way I can kind of draw and track essentially this pixel as it ejects from the gun and get like a realistic motion. So what I want to do is have it eject from kind of the midriff of the gun here, right where it would normally be recoiling backwards. And then we can have the shell kind of arc behind the player. So we might have a couple of different ejection patterns just to add some variance. So I'll probably do 2 or 3 of these. Maybe one will go forward, one will go towards the middle, and one will go back. And then we can just kind of, alternate between those 3 different patterns randomly. just to give it a bit more life. And then as the gun is moving around the screen and as the player is moving, it's going to feel really organic. All right, our player character is roughly 20 pixels tall, so I've kind of sketched out a little box here just to demonstrate. But this is the first frame, and I've got the gun here for reference, but we can obviously disable that. So this is the color I've chosen for the case, and then once we start stepping through here, you can see the arc. So it starts at the gun and moves up and then way out really quickly, and then down quicker, and then down again past the player, slowing down towards the ground, and finally on the ground. So 7-frame animation, so it's pretty quick. So we can go ahead and play that. You know, it looks very snappy at the front and then kind of curves back to the end. I might add in some more frames just to smooth it a little bit. But I'm happy with this to start and kind of see what the effect looks like in Engine. All right, so I've got the shell casings in the game, and they now spawn every time that the player shoots their weapon. So as you can see, it's pretty small. I might actually have to make the shell casing a little more obvious. All right, I'm thrilled with this. We've got 5 different animations for the recoil, and I've added just a slight change in the rotation of the object whenever it's created. So that way it stacks them close, but not exactly like right on top of each other if you have the same animation. So between that variance and the 5 different animations, and me creating a 2 pixel wide object for the actual shell casing instead of just the 1 pixel it was before, it makes it a little easier to notice, which is, I think, what I want for now. We could always make it, you know, a little bit different in the future. What I think we need to do next is make the gun recoil, and then that will add a ton of extra punch to the actual shots between that and the shell casings coming out. Should add a lot of visual effect. So the recoil system was actually really easy because I already have a firing position set up to reference for the weapon sprite. So all I had to do was create a tween and then tween the actual weapon sprite's local position backwards for 0.2 seconds and then back forwards for 0.1 seconds. So it snaps backwards and then is really quick to snap back forward. So it's like you are, you know, recoiling and then controlling for that recoil essentially for the weapon. So it looks really good. And here is the result. So when we fire, we just have a slight impulse for this weapon. But in the weapon stats, I've defined a recoil statistic, and we can change that to however we want. So I will buff that up here in just a second, and we can see what that looks like when it's really exaggerated. So here I went from 1.5 to 10.5 recoil. And you can see it goes from one side of his body to the other. So it's a little extreme, but maybe for something like a really big gun, you know, that has a whole lot of damage, we could do something like this just to be funny. But yeah, there's a lot of flexibility built in here, and you can see it looks very nice with those transitions and easing on the tween. So just a really simple and efficient way to get recoil, especially as we go to add different weapons, because this game will feature more than one weapon, and that system will kind of work like a class system in your traditional roguelite. And that will give us the ability to make them all distinct visually, as well as you know, some of them will be fully automatic or even like scatter shot weapons. And so they're going to have largely different amounts of recoil depending on the type. Well, I've been messing around with the lighting. Let me show you what I'm talking about. I went ahead and disabled enemies just to make this a little bit easier to showcase. But I've added some lighting changes to the overall project, as well as trying to add some muzzle flashlight to the gun. So to start with, we have this radial light that emanates from the player, which I kind of like from a symbolism standpoint, as you're supposed to be like the light in the darkness. But it is a little too on the nose. I think that I feel like this needs to have a little bit more going on, like maybe like some kind of flickering, maybe a sharper transition here from the gradient of the light for it being strongest at the center and weakest at the edges. Because it just, you know, moving around like a circle like that, it's not casting any shadows on the trees or anything. You know, I might end up removing this for now. I'm not exactly happy with it is what I'm getting at. Same goes with the muzzle flash. It does work. So if I fire my gun here, you can see that it's got this little green light here in the center wherever I point the gun. And it looks okay. It's not my favorite. It does cast a little bit of light on the player, but I'm not really thrilled with just, it's just a little sphere at the end of the light. So I think it needs some more work. Not to mention if I like rapid fire, it just stops working because of the way that I'm lerping it with the tween that I'm using to interpolate the alpha channel. So to me, this isn't like the best looking lighting effect. And the fact that it doesn't work half the time is also a little concerning. I don't really think that the gun needs it, having all of these other effects that I have on it, like the shells coming out and the recoil. I feel like that is enough of a visual implication, plus the laser coming out of the gun. So I might just remove the weapon flash and reserve this for really big guns or things that need it, like if you've got some like large rifle or something that shoots really slow, maybe we could do it for that. Let me know in the comments what you think about this lighting system that I have around the player and how you would modify it. So some time has passed. I went ahead and tackled the rolling system, and I wanted to make some changes to make it seem a little bit more realistic. Right now it is working on like a linear acceleration curve, and I wanted to add something that would kind of break that up a little bit and break the roll up into something that looks a little bit more natural, as well as kind of change the stats for the roll just to make it a little bit better in game. And I think I've accomplished both of those things. They're subtle changes, but I'll go ahead and demonstrate. So when we click the roll, we're going to just roll a very short distance since we're not moving. We don't have an initial velocity and we're not getting an initial velocity. But if I start walking and then roll, you can see we've got like it's a short roll, but that'll get better with upgrades later. And it's enough to get out of the way of enemy attacks. If you're astute, you'll notice that I'm printing out some numbers into the console here. So this has to deal with the actual shape of our curve and how this is being bonded to the roll over time. And it starts out pretty close to 1 here, and then it drops down pretty dramatically as we go to end at about 0.7, and then you stop and stand up. So pretty straightforward. This is what the curve looks like, and I'm sorry if it's getting cut off by my recording software. But essentially we start out pretty high and then go all the way to 1 and then stay there for quite a time, a plateau, and then we drop down all the way to 0. And so what we can do is we can take this curve that we have and we can actually compare that to our speed that we're using for our move toward function. And then we just reassign that to the parent after normalizing it. So it makes it really straightforward. We're just multiplying it by this number so that the speed is no longer constant. You're not going to stay at that top speed the whole time. The next problem I need to tackle is the enemy hurt boxes. They are kind of not exactly corresponding to where the enemy is actually hitting the player visually, and I want to change how they work so that it makes the game a bit more challenging and makes it so you aren't getting any weird kind of overlapping with the sprites and the actual hitboxes. So to give a visualization for this, I've drawn the hurt boxes for the enemy in red here around them. And what we can do is when we stop, you can see the second that hurt box kind of overlaps me, they stop moving and they will actually slap me. So if I walk away from them as they're pausing, I'm not hit, even though it looks like I should be hit by their attack, because it's going outside of their hurt box. So that's a visual issue that we need to fix. And then as well as I can just kind of casually walk forward and avoid all damage with this current system. So we obviously don't want that. That's really cheesy and not fun. So with these kind of things in mind, I think I'm going to have a variable system where we move the hurt box out in front, and then we have a attack zone that's maybe a little bit closer to them where they actually start the attack. All right, I've added an attack zone that we can now use to understand how close the player is to the enemy, as well as moved the hurt box out in front of the enemy so that when they actually go to make their attack, it has a much higher chance of hitting the enemy and corresponding with the animation that that respective enemy has. So now we have these four variables: damage zone offset, attack zone, and attack zone offset, that allow us to reposition the shapes on load of the enemy for that particular enemy type so that it better lines up with their animations and makes it look a little more appropriate for the type of attack that the enemy is doing. So for example, the Tame Beast has a really large AoE attack versus this Tribal Warrior, who has a much shorter, smaller, more devastating sword attack. So here in Engine, we can see it really easily. I've got these red circles highlighted around them, but you can see now, okay, this is their actual damage zone, is this red circle, but they don't attack me the second I'm in it anymore. So like I can get pretty far into it before they will attack me. Now, as long as I'm in that red circle when their attack animation finishes, they're gonna hurt me. So it's definitely still easy to dodge, and I will probably have to fine tune it a little bit. This just makes it a lot easier to understand like when you're gonna get hit versus not from a visual perspective. Obviously, we won't have these red circles there all the time. I may actually conditionally put them in when they start their attack, just to kind of showcase where the attack might hit you. But I haven't decided on that yet. I might just leave it out, and because it does add some visual clutter. But now with this level of granularity that I've added, it'll be really easy to change the actual values here and get completely different results for each different type of enemy so that they feel unique and they work in different ways. The one challenge that this adds is that it adds a lot of complexity to the enemy script, which can be bad if there's a lot of enemies on screen. So I'll have to do some performance testing just to make sure it doesn't, overload the game, and that we can handle this added level of complexity. And with that, I think I'm going to wrap it up for today's video. I made a lot of progress on the core gameplay mechanics and just polishing all of that up. The game feels a lot tighter now, and I have a lot more levers to tweak for balancing and just to make that feel even better. So I hope you enjoyed this one, and thanks. I'll catch you in the next one.